Welcome to the deep dive. Ready to jump into some India headlines with me today?
Absolutely. Let's get right into it.
Great. We've got a lot to cover, from economic outlooks to potential energy partnerships, plus some cricket controversy brewing. Should be interesting.
Sounds like a packed agenda. Where should we begin?
Well, I think the economic picture is a good place to start. The IMF is painting a pretty rosy picture, projecting a 6.5% GDP growth for India.
Yeah, 6.5%. That's impressive. They're really highlighting India's stability, especially when it comes to private consumption.
Strong internal market, that's a good sign. But the Indian government themselves seem a tad more cautious, lowering their own forecast to 6.4%.
Right, a slight dip, but still indicating growth. I think to understand this discrepancy, we need to dig into the specifics.
Okay, let's break it down.
Hmm.
What are the factors driving that positive outlook? What's fueling the growth?
Well, infrastructure spending is definitely playing a big role. Lots of projects underway, creating jobs and boosting the economy. Rural consumption is also strong, indicating a healthy agricultural sector.
And don't forget those recent tax cuts. Those were designed to stimulate spending.
Exactly. Those are definitely having an impact. But like you said, the government's being a bit more cautious. So what's holding them back?
Good question. What are the factors that might be slowing things down a bit?
Exports haven't been as strong as hoped. The global market's a bit shaky right now, and that has a ripple effect. Urban consumption is also lagging a bit. Could be a sign of some economic anxieties in the cities.
So a mixed bag overall, with both positive momentum and some areas of concern. It'll be interesting to see how the Reserve Bank of India navigates this landscape.
Absolutely. A lot of analysts are predicting rate cuts and liquidity injections to keep the economy humming along. It's a delicate balance, though, because they need to avoid fueling inflation at the same time.
Speaking of balancing acts, let's talk energy. India seems to be in the midst of a massive expansion of clean energy capacity, but coal is still very much in the picture.
It does seem a bit paradoxical at first glance, doesn't it? You've got a whopping 56,000 megawatts of clean power in the pipeline, solar, wind, hydro, the works.
Those are some big numbers. Definitely points to a commitment to renewable energy. But then you also mentioned that 30,000 megawatts of new coal capacity is under construction, with even more in the planning stages.
Yeah, it's a complicated picture. India is in a phase of rapid economic growth, and meeting those energy demands is a top priority. While they're committed to a clean energy transition, coal remains a readily available and, let's be honest, affordable option in the short term.
So it's almost like they're trying to sprint towards a clean energy future while still carrying a pretty heavy coal-powered backpack.
A very apt analogy. And to add another layer to this energy puzzle, there's the possibility of India increasing its energy imports from the U.S.
Okay, now this is where things get really interesting. Why the U.S., especially considering India has strong energy ties with Russia? What's driving this potential shift?
I think it's a strategic move on both sides. The U.S. wants to expand its energy market reach, and India is looking to diversify its energy sources, which makes them less reliant on any single partner. And of course, it adds this layer of diplomatic strengthening between the two countries.
It's a win-win on paper. But what about the cost? Won't importing U.S. crude be a more expensive option for Indian refineries, considering the distance?
It's true, those short-term costs might be higher, but the potential long-term benefits could include more favorable trade agreements and a more stable energy supply. It's a calculated risk. We'll have to wait and see how it plays out.
Makes sense. A long-term strategy. Okay, shifting gears now to a story that really highlights the risks involved in those ambitious infrastructure projects we were talking about. The tragic tunnel collapse in Telangana.
It's a heartbreaking situation. A tunnel under construction for a major canal project collapsed, trapping 8 workers inside for over 100 hours. The rescue efforts have been going nonstop, but the conditions are incredibly challenging.
It's a stark reminder of the human cost of development and the critical importance of stringent safety measures in these large-scale projects.
Absolutely. It underscores the need for constant vigilance and a commitment to prioritizing worker safety above all else. These are people's lives we're talking about, and no project is worth risking that.
Well said. Now, from a serious matter to something a bit lighter but still generating a lot of buzz, cricket. It seems India's venue choices for the 2025 ICC Champions Trophy are causing quite a stir.
Yeah, playing all of their matches in Dubai has sparked a bit of controversy. A lot of former England cricketers are saying it gives India an unfair advantage.
Unfair advantage, those are fighting words. But I also heard that some of the Indian cricketing legends had some pretty humorous responses to those accusations.
Oh yeah, they did. Some suggested India should appease the critics by switching hotels every few matches, or maybe even playing a game or two in Sharjah just to spice things up.
A bit tongue-in-cheek, but it points to how seriously they're taking this. Can you remind us why this Dubai-centric setup is even in place? What's the backstory?
It all boils down to geopolitics. India's refused to play in Pakistan because of those ongoing political tensions between the two countries. So they came up with this hybrid model where all of India's matches are in Dubai. It was meant to be a compromise, but it's definitely sparked a debate about fairness.
It seems like even cricket can't escape those geopolitical realities. It raises some interesting questions about how these international tournaments are structured and how you find truly neutral ground when politics are involved.
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's a reminder that in today's world, sports and politics are often intertwined, whether we like it or not.
Speaking of leadership and navigating complex landscapes, there's news about a change at the helm of India's Securities and Exchange Board, better known as SEBI.
Right. Tuhinkanta Pandey has just been appointed as the new chairman. He's taking over from Madhabi Puribuch.
Buch's tenure had its share of both achievements and controversies. The investigation into the Adani Group is still ongoing, and the results of that are definitely something to watch.
It's a big one. The allegations of financial impropriety against the Adani Group could have major implications for India's financial reputation. And of course, there are those broader questions about transparency and oversight in India's financial markets.
So Pandey is stepping into a role with a lot of scrutiny and high expectations. What are the key priorities for him?
I think he needs to focus on restoring trust, both domestically and internationally. That means ensuring that the Adani investigation is conducted thoroughly and impartially, and that the findings, whatever they may be, are made public. Transparency is key here.
Absolute transparency is crucial. But beyond this specific case, are there any broader regulatory changes or reforms that you think he should prioritize?
I think there's a growing feeling that SEBI needs to move from a reactive to a more proactive approach to regulation. It's not just about catching wrongdoing after it's happened. It's about identifying potential risks and addressing them before they become major problems.
So it's about building a more robust and resilient financial system that can withstand shocks and maintain investor confidence.
Exactly. Pandey has a big job ahead of him, but it's also a chance to really shape India's financial future.
It sounds like it. Now, before we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, I want to turn to something a bit more, well, weather-related. Apparently, a warm February in North India doesn't always mean a scorching summer.
It's true. It's one of those intriguing weather patterns that scientists have been studying. They analyzed 54 years of temperature data, and it turns out that a warm February doesn't necessarily correlate with a hot April or summer overall.
So we can't just assume that a mild February means we're in for a sweltering summer. What are the factors at play here?
It seems like those large-scale climate patterns, El Niño and La Niña, have a big influence. They can really shake things up.
Can you remind us what El Niño and La Niña are and how they impact weather patterns?
Sure, El Niño and La Niña are essentially opposite phases of a climate pattern that originates in the Pacific Ocean. They influence atmospheric circulation and wind patterns, and those changes have global impacts. So even though they start in the Pacific, they can affect weather all the way over in India.
So how do those patterns typically affect India's weather? What kind of impact do they have?
Well, during an El Niño year, India often experiences reduced rainfall and higher temperatures, especially during the monsoon season, which is crucial for agriculture. And conversely, La Niña can lead to increased rainfall and slightly cooler temperatures. It's like this delicate dance between the ocean and the atmosphere.
Fascinating. So it's not just about local weather patterns, it's about these global forces at play.
Right. And to make things even more complex, we have climate change adding its own unpredictable twist to the mix.
Climate change, the wild card in every weather forecast these days. It seems like it's making it harder to rely on those traditional weather patterns. We're going to need a lot more than a warm February to predict what kind of summer we're in for.
You got that right. It's going to be an interesting few months as we see how it all unfolds. So before we went to the break, we were sort of teasing apart this idea that a warm February in North India doesn't always lead to a super hot summer. And I think that's something that might surprise some folks.
Yeah, it's definitely counterintuitive. I think a lot of people would just assume warm February, hot summer. But as we were discussing those global climate patterns, El Niño and La Niña, they can really throw a wrench in the works.
Absolutely. Those are the big players in the global climate scene. I think it's worth taking a moment to sort of break down how those work because they can sound a bit mysterious.
Yeah, they always make me think of like those old sailor tales about unpredictable seas. But they have real impacts on weather patterns around the world, right?
They do, very much so. So El Nino and La Nina are basically opposite phases of this climate pattern that originates in the Pacific Ocean. They influence atmospheric circulation, wind patterns, all that. And those changes can affect weather patterns globally.
Okay, so we know they start in the Pacific, but how do they impact temperatures all the way over in India?
It's all about those knock-on effects. During an El Nino year, India often sees less rainfall and higher temperatures, especially during their monsoon season, which is a big deal for agriculture. La Nina, on the other hand, can lead to more rainfall and slightly cooler temperatures.
So it's kind of like a seesaw, right? El Nino pushes towards hotter and drier, and La Nina tips the scales towards cooler and wetter.
Exactly. And, to give you a real-world example, back in 97, 98, a super strong El Nino caused a major drought in India, hit crop yields hard, led to water shortages. It was a rough time.
Wow, that's a powerful example of how these climate patterns can have real-world consequences. So this year, with predictions leaning towards a weaker La Nina, are we likely to see those kinds of dramatic effects?
Probably not as intense, but the thing is, climate change is like this added layer of complexity on top of it all. It's getting harder to make long-term predictions. We're seeing more extreme weather events regardless of El Nino or La Nina.
Climate change, always keeping us on our toes. It's the ultimate disruptor. We're going to have to keep a close eye on that. All right, I want to shift gears a bit now and talk about a sector that has huge potential for growth in India. We're talking about CRDMOs.
CRDMOs, definitely a sector to watch. Stands for Contract Research Development and Manufacturing Organization, for folks who aren't familiar. They're essentially companies that make drugs for other pharma companies. Big global industry, and India is really well positioned to become a major player.
So what is it about India that makes them so well suited for this CRDMO boom? What are the key factors driving that potential?
Well, a few things, really. First, the pandemic really exposed how risky it is to rely on just one source for essential things like, well, medicine. Companies want to diversify their supply chain, spread the risk. And India has a large, skilled workforce, so they look like a very attractive option.
So India benefits from this global push towards diversification. That makes sense.
Exactly. And on top of that, the U.S. has put some restrictions on certain Chinese biotech firms, which has basically created an opening that Indian CRDMOs are ready to fill.
It sounds like a real opportunity for India. But you mentioned challenges as well. What are the things that are holding them back? What are the hurdles?
Honestly, a lot of it is bureaucratic stuff. Regulatory processes in India can be pretty slow, which can be frustrating for international companies that want to move quickly. There are infrastructure issues that can cause delays, and the import-export side of things can be tricky too. It makes it harder to compete with Chinese CRDMOs, who often operate in a more streamlined system.
So a case of potential being held back by red tape.
Pretty much, yeah. But there's growing awareness of this, and there are people pushing for change. Industry leaders are calling for government support, things like streamlined approvals, better infrastructure, maybe even specialized CRDMO parks.
Those sound like smart steps.
Hmm.
Is the government listening to these calls for reform?
There are some encouraging signs. They recognize that this sector could be a major engine for economic growth. There are policy initiatives in the works, but there's definitely more to be done to really create a competitive environment.
It sounds like India is at a pivotal moment, and how they handle these challenges will determine whether they can really seize this opportunity. Now, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, which is India's delicate balancing act between Russia and the U.S. when it comes to oil.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation. The U.S. is concerned about India buying Russian oil, while Russia is defending India's right to choose their own energy partners.
It's amazing how something like oil imports can become so politically charged. It's not just about economics. It's about global power dynamics.
Exactly. It's a reminder that in international relations, there are all these layers of complexity, and every decision has consequences.
India's in a tough spot, trying to manage their economic needs and their diplomatic relationships. Not an easy position to be in.
No, not at all. Every move they make has repercussions, so they have to be very strategic.
Like playing a high-stakes game of chess on the world stage. And speaking of games, I want to revisit that cricket controversy we were talking about earlier, the one about India playing all their Champions Trophy matches in Dubai. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a valid concern. I mean, on one hand, I get it. Playing in Dubai is convenient, logistically speaking, and the Indian team will be familiar with the conditions there. But it does raise questions about whether it's truly fair.
Right. It feeds into that narrative that India has an unfair advantage in cricket.
Exactly. I think a more balanced approach, with matches spread out across multiple venues, would have been a better solution, optically speaking.
So it's not just about making fair decisions. It's also about how those decisions are perceived on the global stage.
Exactly. Perception matters, especially when you're dealing with international relations and, in this case, the world of sports.
And that's a good lesson for any arena, whether it's diplomacy, sports, or business. Okay, one last thing I want to touch on before we wrap up. We talked about the change in leadership at SEBI with Tuhin Kantapande taking over as chairman. What's your take on the challenges he's facing?
Perry's got a lot on his plate. He's stepping into this role with a lot of scrutiny, and that ongoing Adani Group investigation is a big deal. It's a real test of his leadership.
Can you give us a little background on the Adani Group investigation? What are the key issues at play there?
Sure. The Adani Group is one of India's biggest conglomerates, and they've been accused of some pretty serious financial misconduct. Stock manipulation, accounting fraud, that sort of thing. The investigation is still in progress, but the outcome could have a big impact on investor confidence in India.
So, high stakes. What are the key things Pandey needs to focus on to restore that trust and strengthen the integrity of India's financial system?
Transparency is absolutely crucial. He needs to make sure this Adani investigation is done thoroughly and fairly, and that whatever they find out is made public. No sweeping things under the rug. He also needs to address those broader concerns about regulatory oversight. Make sure SEBI is proactive, not just reacting to problems after they blow up.
So it's about building a more robust, more resilient financial system that can withstand those shocks and maintain that investor confidence.
Exactly. It's a big challenge, but it's also a huge opportunity for him to leave his mark.
Sounds like it. Well, that wraps up this part of our discussion. We've covered a lot of ground, from climate patterns to economic challenges to cricket controversies. It's been a fascinating deep dive into India's current landscape. All right. Welcome back. We've spent this whole deep dive really digging into some major headlines from India. Everything from economic forecasts to energy deals to even, some cricket controversies and even those fascinating climate patterns. I'm curious, what are your big takeaways? What stands out to you after looking at all these stories?
You know what strikes me is that so much of what we've talked about comes back to this balancing act that India is doing on the global stage. Like, take their energy strategy, trying to meet the demand now with coal, while still investing heavily in renewables for the future.
It's like they're running a marathon while building the track as they go.
Exactly. And you see this balancing act in their diplomacy, too. Navigating those relationships with both the U.S. and Russia. It's this constant dance of priorities.
It's true. And even, think about that cricket thing. Their success on the field sometimes bumps up against that need to make sure everything is fair and balanced for everyone else.
Right. Perception matters. It's not just about being fair. It's about being seen as fair. And that can be a tricky thing to manage when you're a rising power.
Absolutely. And that ambition is evident in the economic realm as well. The IMF's optimistic growth projections, the potential of the CRDMO sector, it all points to a nation that's really striving for a bigger piece of the global economic pie.
No doubt about it. But at the same time, it's important to remember the human element in all of this.
Yeah, that tunnel collapse was a stark reminder of that. Progress comes with risks, and sometimes those risks have a very human cost.
It's a sobering thought. We can get caught up in all these big numbers and ambitious projects, but at the end of the day, real people's lives are affected by the decisions that get made. Safety, regulations, ethical considerations, those have to be front and center, always.
Couldn't agree more. As we wrap up, I'm left with this sense of, cautious optimism, I guess. India is a nation on the move, so much potential, facing these challenges head on. But it's a complex path, and I think their success will depend on their ability to manage all these different, often conflicting priorities.
Well said. It's that age-old question, right? Can they keep up this incredible momentum, achieve their economic goals, while also addressing those social and environmental and geopolitical challenges that come with being a rising power?
The million-dollar question. Or maybe in India's case, the billion-dollar question.
Right. And it's a question that the whole world is watching to see how it unfolds.
Indeed it is. And with that, I think we're going to wrap up this deep dive into India's headlines. Thanks for joining us and exploring all these fascinating stories. We hope this has given you some new insights into the forces shaping this incredible nation.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the world around you.